Imagine unwinding finally, at peace in your own space, only for that peace to be shattered by a question that isn't really a question. Do you belong here? For many of us, for Black Americans, that question is a daily reality, a familiar echo in spaces we're often told aren't for us. It's the silent judgment, the subtle skepticism, the quiet expectation that you might not quite measure up. But what if that quiet strength, that deep reservoir of resilience you've cultivated, is exactly what makes you unbreakable? What if the very thing they underestimate about you is your most powerful weapon? Today we're sharing the story of David Hayes, a man who simply wanted to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. What happened next wasn't just a poolside dispute. It was a profound lesson in the undeniable power of belonging, a testament to the strength that lives in us all when the world tries to tell you where you don't fit. This is a story about what happens when earned peace meets blatant prejudice, and why standing your ground calmly and firmly can change an entire community forever. The late afternoon sun glistened on the still waters of the pool at the Havenwood Residences, a serene apartment complex in a bustling southern city. David Hayes, a 35-year-old senior software architect, leaned back on a poolside lounger, savoring a rare moment of calm. He'd just wrapped up a monumental project, a complex coding feat that had devoured his last few months, and he decided to treat himself. With a good book in hand and the occasional sip of an ice-cold lemonade, the scene was peaceful, almost idyllic. Havenwood wasn't just an apartment to David, it was a symbol. It represented years of grinding work, of navigating predominantly white tech spaces where he often had to prove himself twice as hard. This apartment, this quiet complex, was his earned sanctuary, a well-deserved reward for every late night and every challenge overcome. His peace, however, was about to be profoundly disrupted. The sound of footsteps approached, deliberate and unyielding. David glanced up from his book and saw her Ms. Penelope Sterling. She was in her late 50s, with meticulously styled blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and an air of self-importance that practically preceded her. David had seen her around the complex before, often observing others with a critical eye, a self-appointed guardian of Havenwood's unspoken rules. They'd never exchanged words. Ms. Sterling walked directly toward him, her face a mix of confusion and undisguised suspicion. At first, David, ever the polite resident, thought she might need help, but her expression quickly erased any notion of goodwill. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the lazy afternoon air. "Do you live here?" David paused, taken aback by the bluntness of the question. He felt a familiar weariness settle in his chest, a subtle, almost imperceptible sigh of, "Here we go again." This wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a challenge. It was the same question, just phrased differently, that he and countless Black individuals like him had faced in grocery stores, parks, and even their own neighborhoods. It was the unspoken demand to justify his presence. "Yes, I do," he replied evenly, sitting up straighter. "Really?" she pressed, narrowing her eyes. "Because I've never seen you before. Are you sure you're not visiting someone?" Her lips pursed, as though his truthful answer wasn't satisfactory. "I'm sure. Apartment 402. I've been here for 3 years." Her face tightened. "If that's true, then you should have your key card. Let's see it." The demand was jarring. David felt his chest tighten, a surge of frustration, battling with his practiced calm. He wasn't about to let her dictate his afternoon, or worse, perpetuate a narrative that he didn't belong. He knew instinctively that this wasn't about security. It was about control, about her assumption that his presence was an anomaly. Studies show that Black individuals are disproportionately targeted and asked to prove their legitimacy in everyday public and private spaces far more often than their white counterparts. David understood this painful reality. "I'm not obligated to show you anything," he said, keeping his voice calm, steady. "If you have an issue, feel free to contact management." Her face flushed with indignation. "I will. I'm going to call security right now," she snapped, pulling her phone from her bag. David sighed, leaning back into his chair. He wasn't in the mood for drama, but it seemed like he didn't have a choice. A few other residents lounging by the pool began to notice the commotion. Some exchanged glances, while others subtly pulled out their phones. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. David kept his gaze steady, refusing to let her rattle him. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and he knew it. As Ms. Sterling stepped aside to make her call her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, David couldn't help but wonder how far she'd take this. The growing attention from other residents set the stage for what would soon become a confrontation. Neither David nor the onlookers would forget. Ms. Sterling's voice carried across the pool area as she spoke into her phone, her words dripping with self-righteous authority. "Yes, I'm at the pool, and there's someone here who shouldn't be. No, he says he lives here, but I've never seen him before. I need someone to come down immediately." David could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The onlookers weren't just watching. They were processing. Some seemed uncomfortable, others curious, and a few openly disapproving. A young couple sitting on the far side exchanged whispers, and an older man in swim trunks shook his head slightly. Still no one intervened. This was the familiar script, the public accusation, the silent crowd, the expectation that he, the black man, would somehow break or erupt or simply disappear. David understood this dance. His composure wasn't a lack of emotion. It was a carefully constructed shield built over years of navigating spaces where he was constantly under scrutiny. In the high-stakes world of software architecture, you learn to keep a cool head to think clearly under pressure. But this wasn't about debugging code. It was about defending his very right to exist in his own home. He refused to give Ms. Sterling the angry emotional reaction she seemed to crave, the reaction that would in her mind justify her baseless accusations. He would remain unwavering. Ms. Sterling, emboldened by the lack of interruption, turned back to David. "You could have avoided all this if you'd just shown me your keycard," she said, folding her arms as if she'd won a battle. David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't owe you anything," he said simply. His calm response seemed to infuriate her further. "People like you think you can do whatever you want," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him and the closest bystanders to hear. David's jaw clenched. He wasn't naive. He understood exactly what she meant by "people like you." It was the coded language of prejudice, the subtle sting of racism that many black individuals face daily in seemingly mundane situations. But he refused to let her bait him into an argument. Instead, he shifted his gaze back to his book, flipping a page, as if her words were nothing more than background noise. Minutes later, a uniformed security guard appeared at the entrance to the pool area. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with a look of uncertainty on his face as he surveyed the scene. Ms. Sterling waved him over enthusiastically, her expression triumphant. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, gesturing toward David. "This man refuses to leave. He claims he lives here, but I'm certain he doesn't. He wouldn't even show me his keycard." The guard approached David, who set his book down and stood up, towering over both the woman and the guard. "I do live here," David said, his voice steady but firm. "Apartment 402. You can check with management if you need to." The guard hesitated, glancing between David and Ms. Sterling. "Sir, do you have your keycard with you?" David reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing not just his keycard, but also his driver's license, which displayed the same address as the complex. "Here you go," David said, holding it up for the guard to inspect. The guard nodded, his face flushing slightly. "That checks out," he said, handing it back. "Sorry for the trouble, sir." Ms. Sterling's face twisted in disbelief. "Wait, you're just going to take his word for it?" she demanded. The guard straightened. "Ma'am, he provided the necessary proof. There's nothing else to discuss." The crowd, which had been silently observing until now, began to stir. A few people murmured to each other, and the young couple from earlier gave David a small nod of approval. It was a small victory, a moment of official validation, yet the lingering feeling of being questioned in his own space still smarted. But before the situation could diffuse completely, a voice rang out from the other side of the pool. "Enough is enough." The unexpected interjection turned all heads toward a new figure, a neighbor stepping forward to reveal a history that would change the course of the confrontation entirely. The voice belonged to an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, who had been quietly watching the entire spectacle from her poolside chair. Dressed in a floral sundress and wide-brimmed hat, she stood with a confidence that demanded attention. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a longtime resident of Havenwood, and someone known for her sharp wit and unwavering moral compass. "Excuse me," Eleanor said firmly as she walked toward the small crowd. "But this isn't the first time this has happened, and I think it's about time someone said something." Ms. Sterling spun around, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," she said defensively. "Oh, don't play coy." Eleanor shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You've been harassing people in this complex for months, and we're all tired of it. Just last week, you accused the delivery driver of loitering because he was taking a lunch break in his truck. And let's not forget the time you called the cops on the college kids moving into their apartment because they looked suspicious." Ms. Sterling's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "And now this calling security on a man who's done nothing wrong just because you don't recognize him. You're embarrassing yourself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. The attention was no longer on David. It was squarely on the woman who had instigated the confrontation. Officer Thomas, clearly out of his depth, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't intervene. David, for his part, remained silent, letting Eleanor take the reins. He could feel the tide turning, and it was a profound relief to see someone else, an ally, standing up to the blatant injustice. This was a powerful lesson playing out in real time. Silence is an accomplice to injustice. "Do you even know how ridiculous you look right now?" Eleanor continued, her tone softening just enough to land the point with clarity. "We're supposed to be a community here. Treating people like they don't belong just because they don't fit your narrow idea of who belongs. That's not how we do things." For a moment, there was silence. Then someone clapped. It started slow, but grew as more people joined in. The sound seemed to shake Ms. Sterling, who now looked small and unsure of herself. "This is absurd," she muttered, but the conviction in her voice was gone. She turned on her heel, gathering her things in a flurry of embarrassment, and marched out of the pool area. Eleanor turned back to David, her expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said. "It's not right and it's not fair." David offered a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that." As Eleanor returned to her seat, the crowd began to disperse, but the energy in the air lingered. The incident wasn't over, not yet. Someone had been recording the entire event, and the video was already making its way to social media. What started as a quiet confrontation was about to explode into something far bigger, as the world outside Havenwood took notice of what had just happened. By the time the pool area cleared out, a single recording from the incident had already begun circulating online. A younger resident named Lucas, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, had uploaded the video to his social media with a simple yet powerful caption, "This just happened at Havenwood. When will this stop?" The clip showed everything: Ms. Sterling's accusatory demands, David's calm demeanor, Eleanor's impassioned call-out, and the resounding applause that followed. Lucas, perhaps having seen similar injustices or knowing friends who had faced racial profiling, instinctively knew this moment needed to be documented. He didn't seek fame, he sought accountability. And in doing so, he ignited a wildfire. It didn't take long for the video to gain traction. Back at his apartment, David sat on his couch, still processing the surreal events of the day. His phone buzzed incessantly. Friends, family, and co-workers were tagging him in the video, expressing their support and disbelief. He hadn't anticipated how quickly things would escalate beyond the pool. There was a strange mix of emotions, a wave of vindication that his truth was finally seen, but also a deep sense of vulnerability. His quiet, earned peace had been shattered, and now his private ordeal was becoming a very public spectacle. The weight of all those watching eyes, once confined to the poolside, now felt global. Meanwhile, in the leasing office, the property manager, Miss Anya Sharma, had just been made aware of the situation. She scrolled through the video on her phone, her expression growing more serious with each passing second. This wasn't the first time complaints had been lodged against Ms. Sterling. Miss Sharma had received several informal reports of similar troubling behavior, but always lacked the concrete, undeniable proof needed to take decisive action. This time, there was no denying it. The video was clear, irrefutable evidence. Miss Sharma understood the gravity of the situation, not just for David, but for the entire community she managed. She decided it was time to act. She immediately called a meeting with both Ms. Sterling and David for the following morning. David, though reluctant to relive the ordeal, agreed. He wanted closure not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of such humiliating and unjust behavior. He knew this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a chance to ensure others in Havenwood wouldn't face the same baseless accusations. The next morning, the leasing office conference room was thick with tension as the three sat across from each other. Ms. Sterling looked a shadow of her triumphant self from yesterday. She avoided eye contact with David, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the strap of her purse. Miss Sharma wasted no time getting to the point. "I've reviewed the footage," she began, her voice measured but firm. "Ms. Sterling, this behavior is unacceptable. You have a pattern of targeting residents and visitors based on assumptions that have no merit. This is harassment, plain and simple." Ms. Sterling sputtered. "I was just trying to keep the community safe. How was I supposed to know he lived here?" Miss Sharma's gaze didn't waver. "It's not your job to police who belongs here. That's why we have security and a management team. Your actions have caused unnecessary distress to Mr. Hayes and other residents." She paused, letting her words sink in. "As of today, you are receiving an official warning. Any further complaints of this nature supported by evidence will result in the immediate termination of your lease." David remained silent, watching as Ms. Sterling's face flushed with embarrassment. She tried to protest, but quickly realized she was out of arguments. Finally, she muttered, "Fine," and stormed out of the room, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed the end of her reign of self-appointed authority. Miss Sharma turned to David, her tone softening. "Mr. Hayes, I'm truly sorry this happened. This is not the standard we uphold at Havenwood. If there's anything else we can do to support you, please let me know." David nodded. "I appreciate that. Thank you." As he left the office, David felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the immediate confrontation was over, vindication that his truth had been seen and acknowledged by management, and a lingering sadness that such an incident had to happen in the first place. He knew this official action was a vital step, but he also understood that true change often runs deeper than a formal warning. The digital echoes, however, weren't finished reverberating. The day's revelations weren't over. What had been a private act of defiance had just become a catalyst for a much larger conversation far beyond the quiet gates of Havenwood. By the next morning, the video had amassed millions of views. It was everywhere, on social media platforms, morning news programs, and even major talk shows, all discussing the broader implications of racial profiling and accountability. David Hayes' name and face became the center of a national conversation, something he hadn't asked for, but knew he couldn't ignore. He woke up to an inbox overflowing with messages. There were strangers thanking him for his composure, sharing how his actions had inspired them to confront injustice in their own lives. Activists reached out, offering their platforms to amplify his voice. Even brands and organizations sent emails asking if he'd like to collaborate or speak at events about his experience. This whirlwind of attention was exhilarating yet profoundly draining. David was a software architect used to quiet, focused work, not public scrutiny. But he also understood the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about Ms. Sterling or Havenwood anymore. It was about a pervasive issue that Black individuals faced daily: the exhausting demand to justify their existence in spaces that should be theirs. He knew he had a choice: retreat into his personal life or embrace this unexpected platform. He chose to speak. Still, not all the responses were positive. Amid the flood of support, there were detractors, people accusing him of overreacting, of turning a simple misunderstanding into a spectacle. Some comments echoed Ms. Sterling's own coded language, questioning his motives, implying he was playing the race card. But David, though he saw the negativity, didn't let it faze him. He understood the bigger picture. The incident had struck a chord because it was a microcosm of a much larger systemic problem that needed addressing. His story, however reluctantly shared, had become a testament to the quiet strength and dignity of countless others who had walked similar paths. Meanwhile, the fallout for Ms. Penelope Sterling was swift and public. Someone from the complex anonymously shared more accounts of her behavior, adding fuel to the fire. Her name trended alongside David's, and while a few sympathized with her embarrassment, most condemned her actions. Calls for accountability grew louder, with some suggesting she attend anti-bias training, or even face legal repercussions for harassment. Ms. Sterling, overwhelmed by the sudden public shaming, became a recluse in Havenwood. She kept a low profile, avoiding the common areas, walking quickly whenever she passed others. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, unable to face the community she had attempted to police. This was a bitter twist for her. The very visibility she sought to impose on David now consumed her. While she faced public condemnation, her internal journey, her opportunity for true growth, seemed to be entirely missed. The pressure pushed her further inward, not toward reflection. Back at Havenwood, however, the ripple effects of the incident were palpable. Residents who had once stayed silent began to speak up about their experiences, forming a burgeoning community dialogue about creating a more inclusive environment. Miss Anya Sharma, the property manager, took the feedback seriously, organizing workshops and panels on unconscious bias and community building. The complex, which had once felt fractured by unspoken tensions, began to transform into a place of understanding and connection. Conversations once avoided were now encouraged. This was the quiet, ongoing work of true change, far more impactful than any viral headline. For David, the whirlwind of attention brought unexpected opportunities. He was invited to share his story on a prominent talk show, where he spoke candidly about the importance of staying calm in the face of injustice and the invaluable role of allyship. "It's not just about calling out bad behavior," he said during the interview, his voice calm but firm. "It's about creating spaces where everyone feels they belong, where no one has to prove they have a right to exist." The interview went viral too, further solidifying David as a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. But for him, the true reward came closer to home. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to before started greeting him warmly in the hallways, offering kind words and genuine smiles. Eleanor, the neighbor who had stood up for him, became a regular visitor to his apartment, often bringing over baked goods and stories from her long life, a testament to the enduring power of courage and unexpected friendships. As the dust settled, the incident became a profound catalyst for change, not just at Havenwood, but in the broader conversation about how we treat one another, laying the groundwork for what was to come. Weeks after the poolside incident, life at Havenwood felt different. The community had subtly shifted, and the tension that once lingered between residents seemed to dissipate. People began to see one another differently. Not as strangers to be judged, but as neighbors sharing the same space, each with their own stories and struggles. David noticed the change every time he walked through the complex. Neighbors he'd never spoken to before stopped him for small conversations or offered a friendly wave. Children played freely in the courtyard without their parents watching anxiously from the sidelines. It felt like the walls of suspicion and isolation had started to crumble brick by brick. As for Ms. Sterling, her reputation within the complex was irrevocably tarnished. Though she hadn't been evicted, she kept a remarkably low profile, avoiding the common areas and walking quickly whenever she passed others. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, unable to truly face the community that had for so long silently endured her microaggressions. What was clear was that the incident had forced her to confront her own behavior not just through a formal warning, but through the overwhelming weight of public and community disapproval. Whether or not she would truly change was a question only time could answer, a testament to the fact that personal growth, unlike public outcry, cannot be forced. David, meanwhile, took the lessons he'd learned and turned them into action. With encouragement from Eleanor and other supportive neighbors, he organized a community event at the complex, a barbecue open to all residents. The goal was simple: to foster genuine connection and understanding among people who might never otherwise interact, to build the very bridges that Ms. Sterling's actions had attempted to burn. The turnout was better than anyone expected. Families brought homemade dishes, kids played games, and conversations flowed freely, punctuated by laughter and the sizzle of the grill. Eleanor sat in a corner, chatting with a group of younger residents, her laughter ringing out over the sound of music and chatter. David worked the grill flipping burgers and handing out plates, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment he hadn't expected. This wasn't just a barbecue. It was a visible manifestation of healing, a reclaiming of shared space. By the end of the night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David stood on the patio and looked out over the gathering. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, difficult conversations to be had, and barriers to break down. But it was a powerful start. For the first time in a long time, the community felt like a place where people truly belonged. When the crowd began to thin out, Eleanor approached David with a plate of cookies. "You've done something really special here," she said warmly. "I hope you know that." David smiled, accepting the plate. "I couldn't have done it without you, Eleanor. You were the first one to speak up." She waved him off with a laugh. "Well, somebody had to. But you, David, you turned it into something bigger, something meaningful." As the evening wound down, David found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. What started as a moment of humiliation and frustration had grown into an opportunity for growth and understanding, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The viral video eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by the next trending story. But the lessons it carried remained etched into the heart of Havenwood. David's actions, Eleanor's courage, and the community's response had sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond the gates of their complex. The story of Havenwood reminds us that standing up against prejudice isn't just about confrontation. It's about building bridges, creating dialogue, and fostering spaces where everyone feels safe and valued. Small actions can lead to big changes, but it all starts with the courage to say, "This isn't right." And that courage lives within all of us, especially those who have known the sting of being questioned simply for who they are. If this story moved you, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and your ideas for creating a more inclusive world. Drop your experiences in the comments below. How have you used your voice or actions to challenge prejudice? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire challenge and bring us closer together.